Okay, good morning, or yeah, good morning to everybody. I don't think you got much snow left. We still got snow here outside of my window. Um, so I'm grateful for the Trawl Commission, also for the industry sponsors, Pacific and Danang, and to help make this presentation again this year. And so I'm going to run through the slides and walk through. Yeah, there's plenty of time for questions. I think the microphone is on. I think I can hear you. So if anybody has a question on a particular slide, this is pretty informal, and let's discuss it. And then we'll have more of a discussion afterwards. But more than happy to go through slide by slide. Because I've done this before, most of you know my background. This is just for anybody who might not know me as well. Elena, yourself, worked with Brad for many years. So let's start out. I tried to rethink how to think about the shrimp market this year. And so I thought, okay, what's the question on everybody's mind? It's what's the value of shrimp? What will be the value of shrimp this season? So how do we look at getting an answer or some sort of preliminary answer to that? And my thoughts are, first, we look at local and we look at global supply. We look at market demand. We look at competitive products. What's the volume? What's the product form? What are potential substitutes for our buyers if they were to choose something else? We look at the foreign trade. We look at how much of an export market we have out of the West Coast. And then we look at what's really changed from last spring and how that might help us to understand what we'll look at when the season begins in April. So I'm going to go through each of those areas. That's kind of how this thing is organized. So the first and sort of most important takeaway is that after many years where we saw global Pendalis landings decline, they've really stabilized and are actually going to increase in 2019. And also, as we've learned, and we'll see in a couple of slides, that this change in shrimp abundance really seems related to more favorable temperature factors and interactions with cod. And so where we're seeing this change in abundance is in the Barents Sea and somewhere in Greenland. And those are areas where the growth of the cod population has either plateaued in the Northwest Atlantic, where it stopped growing as rapidly as it was, or it's contracted a little bit, which is the situation in the Barents Sea. Now, the important thing about this is that although global production is going to grow, single frozen, cooked, and peeled production is not. It's not going to grow as much as the overall landings. And the other major issue here is Canadian inshore production, which is probably stabilizing a little bit at a low level, but it may go down this year. So this is the chart, the main chart to look at, and here are the basic big trends. This purple thing here is Canada. And you can see how, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you can see the downward trend in Canada. And the other big producer is Greenland. And we see Greenland has a small upward trend, but the real difference in 2019 is going to be Russia. That's this, whoops, let me go back. That's this dark blue area right here. And the Russian increase is what's the increase in the Barents Sea. It's split between Russia and Norway, but it's the Russian side that's really driving the increase in global production. this year. Now, at the Coldwater Prawn Forum, this relationship between shrimp, global shrimp, and cod has been really clearly laid out with Dr. Vingle, who's been there for several years. And so it immediately made me think that one of the things that's happening in the Barents Sea is that the cod TAC has declined from about 800,000 tons a few years ago to around 600,000 tons or so now. And obviously that is opening up some room for growth in coldwater shrimp. In Canada, the declines that we've seen in the main inshore fishing area, which is Area 6, have actually stabilized this year. And after several years of reductions, we don't really think the inshore shrimp quotas in Area 6 are going to be reduced further. And there are some indications, even with snow crab in that area, that things are stabilizing at a low level. And that's happened at the same time that the cod surveys in Newfoundland have kind of plateaued. And several years ago, we were on a growth trajectory for northern cod, and people were hoping to see growth of a biomass, a spawning biomass of 600,000 tons or more. And that growth has kind of stalled out. And so the Canadian cod stock hasn't decreased. It's still in the 300,000 to 400,000 ton range, but the increases have slowed. And I think that's giving a opportunity for shrimp. So the net result here is that in the North Atlantic, we've got a more favorable environment for shrimp. So we might see a continuation of some of this change of direction. So we've just talked about this. The Barents Sea is where I think we're doing the most changes. In Canada, I see more signs of stabilization. The Gulf of St. Lawrence, though, this is where the big cuts are going to happen this year. And not because of cod. The Gulf actually has a very large stock of redfish with a several 100,000 ton biomass. And I don't know scientifically whether there's a interaction between redfish and Pandanus stocks, but the shrimp surveys in the Gulf are really terrible. And we're going to see some cuts there.
Hey, John?
Yeah?
It's Nick. I just heard this morning that in the Anticosti area, it's going to be 15% in the Gulf, because there's 4 areas in the Gulf, and the other one's going to have a 37% reduction, and I can't pronounce it.
It's called sept eels. We're going to discuss that. Sept Isles, yeah. We're going to discuss that, and that has some implications for our market. Okay, so now let's look at cooked and peeled. Remember, the global landings, we saw an increase. But if we look at our estimate of cooked and peeled landings, what we're seeing is, why does this keep doing that? What we're seeing on the estimate of cooked and peeled landings is that they're stable between 2018 and 2019. And what that is that even though we see some sort of decrease in Canada, and I don't know what the forecast is on the West Coast. We can have more of a discussion on that, but reading the shrimp report and looking at the water temperatures and looking at the abundance of year ones and what might be coming in, my hope is that we'll see a little bit more landings here, but I've been pretty conservative. Norway is where we're seeing probably the biggest increase in shore-based single frozen, cooked and peeled. Um, and then we're also seeing an increase in Greenland. Greenland has both offshore, operated by Royal Greenland. It has both offshore trawlers who do freezing at sea, and then they land some shrimp that has to be turned into cooked and peeled in inshore factories. And they also have a requirement that a certain amount be landed inshore. And that Greenland projection is a combination of both, no, it doesn't include their twice frozen. It's what is required to be inshore single frozen. But anyway, the upshot is overall landings are going up. Cooked and peeled landings are remaining stable. So now let's look at twice frozen, because that is kind of probably the biggest change in the cooked and peeled category. And so if we look at single frozen, which is this slide that's on the bottom here, you can see our estimates are that single frozen production should be stable. If we look at twice frozen, we see something very different. And the reason is that there's two reasons there. First, the Canadian offshore quota, which has not been as cut as much as the Canadian inshore quota in the last couple of years, although this year there are going to be some cuts to the offshore quota. But the big change is in the Russian and Barents Sea. And a number of shrimp trawlers that had been operating offshore in Newfoundland have been sold to the Russians as the Newfoundland quota has gone down. And this year, they're beginning to operate in the Barents Sea. And the Russia has a shared Barents Sea quota with Norway. That total quota is about 90,000 tons. And those numbers are included in all our estimates about Norwegian numbers. But on the Russian side alone, we're estimating an increase of about 20,000 tons in 2019, all of which is going to be frozen at sea production. And the smaller stuff always goes into industrial production. And and there's some Russian production in the Far East as well. But as that Russian harvest increases in the Barents Sea, there's talk of putting an inshore shrimp plant in Murmansk, which would then be able to produce a legitimate single frozen product as well. Anyway, the key thing we're looking at this year from a market point of view is increases in twice frozen cooked and peeled shrimp. Now, if we look at U.S. production, this shows fresh, frozen, and exports of coastwide and Oregon landings. So that you can see that the volumes of these products very carefully mirror the changes in the volume of landings. Fresh shrimp that goes directly to the retail trade during the season, I've gotten estimates of around 15% of the total catch goes right through that channel. So that even though it's cooked and peeled, et cetera, it's not frozen. It's just sent right out to supermarkets, often ungraded. The rest of it is frozen, and then there's also exports. And I think that there's two scales on this chart, so I don't want you to get confused here. The right-hand scale is landings. And so if you read that, in Oregon, we've got close to 15,000 tons of shrimp landed in 2018. The left-hand scale is the product volume. And so the exports you're reading over here are just under 6,000 tons. And the U.S. Frozen would be in addition to that. So we have these two things together making up our product volume. This is the Canadian production of the two lines again are the offshore landings and the inshore landings. And you can see that the Canadian inshore has been declining faster than the Canadian offshore. And then you can look at the cooked and peeled production, which again is the left-hand scale is the landings. So we're down to like 26,000 tons of landings for cooked and peeled. And the actual production volume is about 7,500, 8,000 tons in these charts. These are taken from various sources, including presentations at the Coldwater Prawn Forum, but you get the general idea. So it looks like cooked and peeled volume for single frozen is stable. There may be a little bit of increase in the US and Norway. There's probably going to be a decrease in Canada, and we expect some stability in Greenland. What is more of a wild card is it's not clear how much industrial twice frozen cooked and peeled is going to be produced. And this very much depends on market prices and demand, and also the size of the product, because when a offshore trawler is breeding on shrimp, they grade it by size, and the larger size, like something that would be the equivalent of a 150, 250 cooked and peeled shrimp, normally it has a better market as a cooked in shell product, and so they would tend to cook those on board. They don't have a good market for the smaller shrimp, the 250, 350, 350, 500. They don't have a market for that as a cooked frozen shell on shrimp, and so that's the there it's economically more favorable for them to freeze that and then bring it ashore and run it as cooked and peeled shrimp and then refreeze it into twice frozen. So it's very size dependent and somewhat market dependent. And when the price of cooked and peeled shrimp has been high historically, as it is now, it attracts more volume from the offshore factory trawlers into the industrial twice frozen market. Okay, so now we're going to turn to some market discussion. The supply and demand has been pretty balanced right now, unlike the beginning of 2017. We're not seeing any price gyrations. We're saying that we're seeing prices for cooked and peeled single frozen be relatively stable, actually for twice frozen as well. So here are some pricing charts. The first one on the left is imported Borealis. This is the price mostly on the East Coast. You can see the price by sizing. There was a weakness in the spring of 2017 that was not repeated in 2018, and prices have been relatively stable. Sorry, whoops. Prices have been relatively stable after, for the last 6 or 7 months. They came up a little bit in the summer. You can also see this if you look at the percent change, which is instead of the actual dollars, you look at the percent change. And what we see here is that by 2018, May through now, we're up about I don't know, 5 or 6% over where we were in 2016, and up about 10% or so of where we were in 2017. Now, one of the things I tried to get at this year with some help from some industry sources was what was our pricing on the Jordani instead of just looking at Borealis. And so this is the percentage change. This blue line here is the price change percent of the 250, 350 Borealis. And the green line is the percent of change over that same period of a 250, 350 Jordani. And what we've actually seen, and that might have been due to lower volumes, but the percent increase in the Jordani price has been higher than the percent increase in the Borealis price for the 250, 350. For the smaller sizes, not true at all. The smaller sizes are lower in price than they were last year. In 2018, were lower than they were in 2017. So this lets us get at some price differential. So when we look at these East Coast pricing, where we have good publicly available price data, how does that relate to the price of Pendalis on the West Coast? And so I was able to do some yearly averages, which is what you see in this graph on the left here. These are our yearly average pricing by size, and it shows you where that the Pendalis has a slight pricing advantage over the Jordani, which gets more pronounced on the smaller sizes. In 2017, where there was that period of price weakness on Pendalis, both species, the Borealis pricing recovered more quickly than the Jordani pricing, and in the 250, 350 size, and that's what's led to the larger price gap of the two in 2017. It's also important to look at the pricing of twice frozen, and we have a good price series there from Iceland, because Iceland brings in about 5,000, well, they bring in offshore shrimp, primarily from Canada, and they produce about 5,000 tons of twice frozen cooked and peeled shrimp that they sell primarily to the UK. And so you can look at the Icelandic price series of what their sales are into the UK by size, which is better than what you can get on the export products. And here again, you see on the twice frozen, a lot of price stability in the 100, 200, and 250, 350 sizes. And same thing on the 500, 800 sizes, but at a much lower level. This is converted to a US dollar per pound. So there are some currency factors in there. But one of the issues that the Canadians bring up is the Icelandic plants are highly efficient. And so a Canadian offshore trawler, let's say, that's looking at, do I land my product in Newfoundland and produce twice frozen product in Newfoundland, or do I ship my product to Iceland? They're likely to get a better price from Iceland because the Icelandic plants are so efficient on that. Now let's look at our export pricing. It's another way of looking at pricing. It's not by size, but it's by market. And what you can see here is in this purple line is the U.S. exports to Canada of cooked and peeled shrimp, and you can see that when you average out all the sizes as of last December, the price was a little bit under $5. What we're also seeing, which is interest to me, is that we're seeing a spike in 2018 of exports to Denmark. The Canadian market is kind of straightforward. The Danish market, there's been a big change in monthly volume. And as that's happened in the last few months, the prices to Denmark and the prices to Canada have been very similar. Another way to look at the difference between single frozen and twice frozen pricing is to look at Canadian sales to the UK compared to Icelandic sales to the UK. Canadian sales to the UK are almost entirely single frozen product. There's a very strong sales channel between Newfoundland single frozen plants and UK buyers. And Icelandic sales to the UK are almost exclusively twice frozen product. So I found this gave us a chance to compare the value of the two and see what kind of price discount does a twice frozen cooked and peeled shrimp get. And so if you look at the average here, 488 and 450, that tells us that over 3 years, we're seeing a differential between once and twice frozen in the marketplace of about 38 cents a pound. This is kind of right in the middle of where, at least the Canadian sources tell me, people begin to switch. And when the differential is less than that, you know, as you can see here, for most of 2018, there's little incentive to switch. 20, 30 cents, not enough. Buyers who want a single frozen, who like the better quality, who require it in their sandwich production or in their retail spec in the UK, they're going to stick with a single frozen product. But when the price differential gets up to the range of 60 to 70 cents, which is close to where it is currently, at least according to my Canadian friends, there's more incentive for some of the UK buyers to begin to say, well, for 60 or 70 cent differential, I'm going to switch to a twice frozen product. And so what the impact of that is that it limits how expensive, how much more expensive a single frozen product can get than a twice frozen product. And it kind of puts even though there's let's say no change in supply or even a decrease in supply of single frozen product, if the price of twice frozen product, the price differential or discount gets too great, it begins to bleed some customers from the single frozen to the twice frozen. So it's kind of a moderating influence. So now let's talk about market demand. This is another section that we're going to go through. The increases in supply, we've all talked about, they're coming from twice frozen. I've explained how the industrial shrimp are the smaller sizes because larger sizes on board factory vessels can be cooked and sold as an in-shell cooked shrimp for more money. So the big question is, the twice frozen market is showing some signs of price weakness, as you could see in that chart of Iceland, where there's a little bit of beginning of discounts there. If this summer comes and there's more twice frozen product in the market and the price adjusts downward, we don't know if single frozen will follow or if the price differential between the two product forms is going to get wider. The answer to that question will do will help determine what our actual market prices are out by August, September of this year. So what are the substitute products for people who use cooked and peeled? Well, the single biggest substitute is twice frozen, obviously. And the UK market does buy both. And when twice frozen prices are more favorable, they do buy more of that product. The Danish export market, though, can't really use a twice frozen product. When you're making a brine shrimp, the quality is not good enough if you're going to use twice frozen. So the Danish buyers are really locked into the single frozen market. And one of the things that is sparking this growth in demand from Denmark for West Coast or Jordani shrimp is because they see they're being limited from Canada and elsewhere. And so they're out looking for sourcing of single frozen anywhere they can. And they are price sensitive buyers. It doesn't mean they don't care about price. They care about price a lot, but they're not in a position where they can switch to a less expensive product, twice frozen product, just because it exists. So the big sources, we'll see where Denmark gets their products in a minute. The other thing that's a substitute, at least in the U.S. market, or in my question is, what about the rest of the shrimp market? Do other shrimp buyers in the U.S. or the U.K. tend to switch to warm water shrimp when there's a big price differential? And my answer for the U.S. is no, they don't switch. And you can tell that by looking at this price chart, which is that the bottom, the red line here is the Urner Barry warm water farm shrimp price index. And the blue line is Coldwater, 250, 350 Coldwater. And so what we have here is these prices tend to move really independently of each other. So at a time when the warm water prices got really high back in the EMS time, prices for cold water didn't increase. They remained low, which means that you weren't having a lot of demand moving over from warm water to cold water shrimp. And then the same thing, as the shrimp prices got really low, prices for cold water 250, 350 were rising considerably. And so what that tells me is these markets are really operating in different buckets, and you're not really in the U.S. getting much of an overflow. The West Coast pink shrimp buyers want that West Coast pink shrimp, and it doesn't do them any good that a white farm-raised shrimp might be selling at a low price because they still want the West Coast shrimp. The UK, though, it's not quite so clear-cut. In the UK, the retailers do tend to go back and forth between these warm water and cold water products. And this is just a chart of import cold water and warm water import volumes. You can see the UK really uses that holiday market, but when you look at UK retail advertising and pricing, they do promote more warm water shrimp when cold water prices are high, and they promote cold water shrimp when warm water prices are high. And so it operates a little bit differently than the US market on cooked shrimp. The overall shrimp market, I just want to say a couple of words about that. It's really healthy right now. This is some food service and retail data from a recent NFI conference. And you can see at the bottom here, about 65% of the shrimp goes into food service, about 35% goes in retail. That is pretty standard year over year. I think for the cooked and peeled Coldwater shrimp, there might even be a higher volume in food service, but I'm not sure. We weren't able to break it out. We do see increases in shrimp retail sales volume year over year. That's being driven by the lower prices that we saw in the earlier graph. And we also see the percent of households buying shrimp at retail is increasing. And this is really healthy. These are all scan data from Nielsen IRI. And what the households number shows you is that what percent of Americans put shrimp in their shopping basket in a given year. And so back in 2014, only 44% of people who make shopping trips would buy shrimp at least once during the year. By 2018, that increased to 48.2%. And so what that represents is like a 10% increase in the physical number of customers who are putting shrimp in their retail baskets. And that's one of the things that's accounting for this volume. You have more people buying shrimp, and at the same time, among the shrimp buyers, you have them buying higher volume. So it's a very, very healthy situation. I was hoping I could break out some Coldwater shrimp from this data, but I couldn't, because the reason is there's not enough clarity on what they call pink shrimp. It's very obvious that pink shrimp sales increased a lot in the Western region in food service this past 12 months. Not all of that is what we would call exactly Coldwater shrimp. I think there's other shrimp mixed in there that could be calling some of that Argentinian shrimp pink shrimp as well. But I do think what we can be confident of is that in this increase in shrimp sales in the Western region, we're seeing increase in Coldwater shrimp as well. So it's participating in that healthy trend. So another thing that surprised me when I looked at global trade, we're now going to shift now to the global trade picture, is how much Coldwater shrimp represents as a share of wild caught shrimp. I mean, everybody sees these numbers that there's 3.5 million tons of warm water shrimp, and there's only 300,000 tons of Coldwater shrimp. But out of that warm water shrimp, there's an awful lot of warm water shrimp that never goes into international trade. And so when you actually look at the FAO figures on who's buying wild shrimp, the Coldwater shrimp is a much bigger share of the trade of wild shrimp. In the figures from FAO for 2016, it represents 36% of the shrimp trade. And the UK and Denmark are still the largest markets for cooked and peeled shrimp. Of course, Asia, China would probably be the largest market for the shell-on Coldwater shrimp, and Japan is an important market for the larger size of that. This is just the numbers here. This is Coldwater species producing, I guess, Canada, Greenland, US, Norway, Russia, etc. And this is the warm water species. But here's where that number comes from. Coldwater shrimp is not quite twice as much as Argentinian red shrimp, for example, which has been really popular. Let's look at exports, because the strength of the Coldwater export market is very important to the market demand and pricing on West Coast shrimp. And the most positive thing to look at is this big jump in exports to Denmark in 2018, and how Denmark represents the largest of these markets. We also see an increase in exports to Sweden, not so much other European countries, which includes like the UK, because the US doesn't really export much to the UK. There's a little bit to Norway, a little bit to Germany, but not a whole lot. There is an increase in exports to China, and China, I can't tell in the data whether this is cooked and peeled or shell-on shrimp, but there is, 2 years ago, we definitely saw, and 3 years ago, we definitely saw some shipment of frozen shell-on shrimp to China from the West Coast. I can't tell from this whether that has come back a little bit. I mean, there are an awful lot of trade links with the Dungeness crab and gooey duck and other exports to China, sablefish. So there could be some shrimp that is getting in that way as well. And even though everybody talks about the China tariffs, the interesting thing is that the tariffs have put a damper on China buying U.S. products, but they haven't shut it off 100%. And again, I don't know the months that this took place. And finally, our shipments to Canada sort of mirror
he could get by probably
supply down.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Is someone on the call? Sorry, John.
Say that again, Elena. I can't hear you.
Mute themselves on the. I recall
Wants to sue us?
You want to mute people who are on the call, who are phoning in from other places?
Yes.
Ah,
We hear them right now.
you're hearing other people. Can I do that?
No, we're good now.
Yeah, we
Somebody
heard
heard
some.
Okay.
Shut your phone off.
Sorry, John.
Okay. Okay. Fine. So we're all set. Let's go back to where we were here. We're talking about exports to China. Okay, I think we covered that. Canadian exports are sort of following the abundance of landings. There doesn't seem to be any change in demand. Now let's look at Canadian exports of cooked and peeled, which is the most direct competitor both in U.S. and Europe. And here's Canadian exports to the U.S. It's been very steady. It's followed downward trend in the landings. The UK has been the most important market to Canada, but it's again declined because of the decline in landings. Here's Denmark, other Europe, and Asia. And the important thing is, here's the total Canadian exports are declining as the catch falls. What's important, I guess I'll mention this right now, is that most of these exports to the U.S. from Canada are from Quebec. And the reason they're from Quebec is that the plants in Quebec, a number of them don't have the BRC certification, and they can't meet the specs for exporting to Europe, to retailers in Europe, and they can't meet some of the high-end retail specs here people want, like BRC or something similar. And so their market has been mostly the U.S. market rather than the rest of the Canadian provinces, which are going into Europe and so forth. Now, they're the ones who are seeing the biggest cut in production this year in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And so what that means is that I wouldn't be surprised to see the amount of cooked and peeled from Canada coming into the U.S. market cut in half. And that is definitely a competitive opportunity for West Coast cooked and peeled single frozen shrimp. This is just a total Canadian exports. I wanted to show Denmark because that's also important, competitive market for us. Well, Denmark, is tied to Greenland. They own Greenland actually, and so most of their shrimp does come from Greenland. And as Greenland has been increasing their quotas lately, they've increased their shipments to Denmark as well. This is Canada, Canadian shipments to Denmark. UK, here's the US. In the US, I didn't have the 2018 numbers, but as we've seen in other graphs, US shipments to Denmark increased a lot in 2018, which is positive for us. But again, we're a very small supplier in the overall Danish market. Now let's just talk a little bit about some of the info from the shrimp report and kind of just to gain a quick perspective as to where we are coming into the season. Well, we've seen the big increase in the annual landings. That's very positive. My interpretation of this very long-term graph is that the increases in landings do tend to run in cycles, and we can't tell for sure. Here's a year where it went up and then down again, but in most years when it started going up, it's continued for a couple of years. And here's the pounds per trip, which have increased. And this is our chart of coastwide landings and the Oregon price. And we saw in 2018 both an increase in volume and an increase in price, which was mostly a rebound from the weakness in the 2017 market. And so as you saw in some of our percentage graphs, we're really kind of back at the level where we were in 2015 and 16. And of course, this average price is heavily influenced by size. These are just a couple of highlights again from the great report done at OSU. But the interesting thing they were emphasizing that caught my eye was the correlation between the El Nino and where we have a lack of El Nino and increased volumes. And you guys are probably more up on this than me, but I thought that the outlook for sort of the water conditions and temperature this year was kind of more what we'd expect and less of what has been happening in big El Nino years. This is just the shrimp price per pound and the size count per year. And one of the things that I don't know what everybody else's take on this is, but I would think there's a lot of years here where we have larger average count sizes than we've had in the last couple of years. And I think that might mean that we might be seeing potentially a larger average size, again, also depending on when the fishing effort takes place. But if we have a influx of leftover year one, which are now year two shrimp at the beginning of a season here, we could be back to a more trend closer to these other 2 years with larger sizes at the beginning. That would tend to average out for a larger size for the whole year. These are just Newfoundland inshore prices. I like to include it because people are well aware of the Newfoundland situation, and their prices went up in 2018 compared to 2017. I very much I mean, there's no, I don't know yet where the Newfoundland price negotiations are going to go. The fact that there's going to be less shrimp there may or may not indicate that there'll be a higher pricing. It's going to be a negotiation, obviously. This is the estimate for Canadian production in 2019. Now, this is also from the Coldwater Prawn Forum, but it's not a great visual. But if we looked at the cooked and peeled supply in Canada, we have it from the Newfoundland, we have it from the Gulf, and we have it from Nova Scotia. And so altogether, that came to about 26,600 tons last year, which has been on a steady downward trajectory. I think that's going to continue in 2019. The reason the offshore quota might decline a little bit too, but that doesn't concern us as much. But the reason I expect the inshore landings to go down is the northern areas, fishing areas 4 and 5, which are off Labrador. These are also primarily offshore areas. Those quotas in that region may be down 40%. There's a very small inshore component to that, only 1,000 or 2,000 tons. And so even though that's going to be cut substantially, it's not going to have a big impact on the cooked and peeled, but single frozen, but it will have a small impact. More importantly is that Area 6, which is the area off of the northeast coast of Newfoundland and where most of the inshore shrimp is landed from, that's likely to be stable. And so adding that all together, my estimate is that maybe we'll have about 9,000 tons of cooked and peeled from Newfoundland, which would be a small decrease from last year. The Gulf is going to be down more seriously. I think I have a slide of the Gulf here. I'll show you where the different cuts are taking place. But my estimate is that the Gulf is going to get cut about 20% or so, which would bring them down to about 11,400 tons. And so you add that all together, and so we're looking at maybe 23,000 tons versus 26,000 tons, which is about 14% or so. There are 6 peeling plants operating currently in Newfoundland. Notre Dame shut their plant last year. This processing capacity is still way too high for the current inshore quotas. And some of these plants, like the ones owned by OCI and Berry Group, they have access to offshore shrimp. And some of these companies may want to divert some of their offshore shrimp to these plants. Royal Greenland can do that as well to produce a twice frozen. The economics of this are don't really give you a good answer one way or the other because the offshore vessels, even though they're within the same company, aren't going to want to sell to Canada, their plants in Canada, if they can still get more money selling to Iceland. And as I said before, Iceland pays them a good price because the Iceland plants are very, very efficient. This is a slide I was looking for on the Gulf. This is Sept-Îles, I think is how you pronounce it. This is where most of the Gulf production is concentrated, and it's also where most of the inshore Quebec plants get their shrimp. And this is the area where they're looking at, they had about a 15% reduction last year. They're looking at maybe a 35% reduction this year. Anacostia, which is these two areas here, had a 15% reduction last year, going to get another 15% reduction this year. The Lamec plant, the plants that operate in this area of Northeast New Brunswick, Shippagan, etc., they primarily get fishing out of the southern zone of the Gulf. And so they're not going to be as affected by the cutbacks as the Quebec plants over here are going to be affected. Newfoundland also gets some of this shrimp here. But Lamec has been known as producing a large size shrimp. The fact that the Gulf quotas are going to be cut so much does mean that this area also produces a larger size shrimp. It's going to cut down the production of larger size cooked and peeled shrimp, and it will help widen the price differential by size, because single frozen cooked and peeled large shrimp are definitely going to be more scarce because of this change in the Gulf. So this is the last slide. This is a summary. Just our points are that the production of Pandalis is increasing, especially in Barents Sea. This increase is going to go to twice frozen. Single frozen cooked and peeled volumes are going to be lower due to reductions in Canada, partly offset by increases in Greenland and possibly the West Coast. Cutbacks in the Gulf will be more pressure on larger sizes. So we're going to have less 150, 250, 125, 175. We're going to have a bigger spread of pricing between sizes. Favorable conditions, i.e. no really super warm water, the shrimp biomass should continue to increase. And so we might see another bump up in landings. Prices have shown a lot of stability. There seems to be a kind of balance in the market. And there's no evidence so far that demand is out for single frozen cooked and peeled. Things at the moment appear to be stable. So that's the end of the slides. And so now I'm going to go back to the main screen. And I'm really happy if we want to talk about questions and so forth.
Yeah. That was a good presentation, John.
Well, thank you. Can you guys see me? I don't know if I have a webcam on or not.
We do not see.
Just see the audio. Let me see if I can find the video here. Share my webcam. Let's do that. And okay. Well, sorry. It'd be nice if you could, but for whatever reason.
We're on there a minute ago when she was moving it around. Or a second.
Oh, maybe you're hiding. Let's see.
Drop the screen back. It was on there earlier.
And I lost my mouse.
Oh yeah, Elaine, you might be able to have me on there somewhere.
Okay. Behind the presentation.
Just minimize the PowerPoint. Can you see that? Did you hear? Just collapse the PowerPoint. You might be there.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, got it. No. Maybe I'll switch control back to you, and that might do it. So I'm going to
Now, who sees my mouse again?
change presenter. I'm going to put you as presenter.
Okay. All
Is
right.
that
No, we still don't see you.
okay? Well, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, okay, I guess we'll just have to do a disembodied voice. Sorry about that.
So, John, you talked a lot about the Barents Sea. I didn't hear you bring up Norway at all. Maybe I missed that. What's the activity of Norway, and how are they going to play into it? I know you talked a lot about Iceland taking advantage of that for twice frozen. Where does the Norwegian fleet come in?
Okay, well, Tor Edgar, as you know, he said in his data, Norway is getting some of that increase also. And so he breaks down the portion of single frozen raw material that comes into Norway, and that's going to go up to close to 30,000 tons. I think that's about 10,000 tons more than in 2018. So they're getting, there is a shared quota between Norway and Russia, and so part of that Russian quota that's increased goes over to Norway. And so the Russian portion of the increase by themselves was 20,000 tons. And there was an additional, I think it's on the order of 10,000 tons, which is in the Norwegian sector. And by memory of Tor Edgar's numbers is that about 10,000 tons is going into the single frozen raw material.
Thank you.
Yeah, John, we were all talking to the same person here, Tor Edgar, and Charlie and I both have been talking to Tor. But Tor indicated also that there is going to be more participation in Norway, but that's right now they're making really good money fishing cod, and when it becomes more profitable, that they will switch to shrimp. But it's only more profitable. But there is going to be an increase.
Increase in volume for shrimp.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about Russia, with Yola's presentation that she made, we had her presentation in London, they said that about 8% of what they caught was exported to China, none to the U.S., not to Denmark, but it was strictly to China. And there was 18 vessels, but they are going to increase the amount of vessels this upcoming year. But the export market from her presentation said China.
China, yes, for the whole cook, head-on shrimp. That's what goes into the Chinese market. But remember, again, that's priced by size, and so economically, some of those boats will be producing. In other words, once you have the shrimp on board, you can decide where to send it, and if there's a stronger demand in Iceland, for example, for a 250, 350 for a not the live size, but for a cooked and peeled market, they'll send some of that to China, some to Iceland. But you're right, the majority of that is going to go to China, and it's not necessarily going to come all into a twice frozen market, because the industrial shrimp really depends on, the volume varies depending on how strong the market is into for the other forms, the head-on form. But I think there's a pretty good consensus, at least from the people I've talked to, that we are going to see an increase in twice frozen this coming year, but not in single frozen.
John, I guess just overall, it just looks like a strong market for the year, doesn't it?
Well, similar to last year. Yeah, last year was a strong market too.
Well, you show the retail sector, increasing in volume, or in sales anyway. Hey, when you were talking about, single frozen versus twice frozen, I did some math here the other day that from Canada, it used to be the largest, I think in 2010, their quota for Canada was about 164,000 metric tons. I saw that in your slide too. But now the cook and peeled market to 2018, we did the math there with some guys in Quebec, and it's decreased 6% from that 164,000 metric tons. So I believe that we will see a difference between the pricing between single frozen and twice frozen, because Canada is reducing yet again, and Jordani is the one that produces it. Unless unless Greenland's going to build that plant. But we are going to see a bigger spread of the amount of availability, and I believe that the cook and peeled market is going to continue to be short in the future.
Well, the issue here, I think the way to think about it, you can't think in terms of absolute volume. You have to match the volume with customers. And, you know, we've been through this situation where we had a long decline in Pandalis landings and availability. And during that time, we've shed a lot of customers. And so, and the price has gone up. As you could see in the graphs there, we're right at the highest price levels we've ever been at. So I don't think that there's and you guys know this because I say it every year, so it's nothing new. But I don't think there's an automatic translation that if we're X number of tons short from last year, that therefore the price has to go up X percent. Because what that leaves out is that the customers who back away because they buy less at the higher price. And the reason we haven't seen price gyrations, you know, like remember in 2017, we thought we had an oversupply for the market, even though the Canadian landings had come down a lot. But in the spring of 2017, everybody was saying the sky is falling and prices were coming right down. And that actually colored some of the thinking about what was happening in the market. And then it reversed. And in a couple months, pretty much after Brussels of that year for Pandalis and later in the summer for Jordani, there was very much a recognition that, oh, hey, we do have buyers for this shrimp, and prices snapped right back to where they had been. And then they've come up a little bit in 2018. But just because the volume goes down doesn't mean that it can't be a situation where people start building up unsold levels of shrimp. And that's what happened in 2017. Now, I'm not saying that's happening in 2018 at all. I think the market's healthy. I think the volumes are there. I think that the West Coast has a chance to increase its market share of single frozen cooked and peeled. And I think the sizes might even be more favorable. So all of those things I think are really, really healthy indicators.
John, can you speak to the, I'm looking at your slide on page 22, as far as the white shrimp index, speak to the farm shrimp segment, healthy?
Yeah. For anybody who wants to look at that slide, shrimp market is sinking like a stone. I mean, there's just been a big increase in farmed shrimp production in India, in Ecuador, and basically the growth of production has kind of caught up. And so the U.S., this is now the third year that the U.S. has had record levels of imports of farmed shrimp. And the retail, you know, if you compare like shrimp and crab, like Dungeness or snow crab, for example, shrimp has been the go-to product for retailers to promote. It's been the go-to product for food service. And as the prices come down, they've increased their promotions and their volume, but they still haven't stayed ahead of the production that's coming from India and coming specifically to the U.S. market. So I think that's going to be, we're going to see low shrimp prices for a while. At some point, it's going to turn around. But I think that in the U.S., the link between that and the Coldwater shrimp has been pretty tenuous. It's not that it's not there, but that the guy the chef who's buying a Coldwater shrimp, he's buying a warm water shrimp also, and he's not going to swap one for the other. He's just going to adjust his quantities a little bit, but he still wants to use both of them.
John, do you have anything that has that same correlation internationally?
Well, I know in England and the UK, it's different. It's not. I don't think there's a correlation internationally. I mean, I think in some markets there is, and in some markets there isn't. It sort of depends on how the shrimp is used. And in the UK, the retailers who, remember, the UK is the biggest market for cooked and peeled shrimp. And the retailers have a big promotion activity on cooked shrimp. And what the retailers have found is that they can take a Honduran king prawn, they call it. It's a cooked warm water shrimp, maybe a 30, 40 or 40, 50 counts. And they can sell a lot of those shrimp. And when they put that on special, the UK buyers who are sort of used to just keeping a little plastic tub of cold water shrimp in their refrigerator, they buy the king prawns. And the sandwich guys make sandwiches out of cooked prawns. And so in the UK, I do see those markets as somewhat interrelated and elastic and going back and forth. But on the US, I don't see it as much, probably because in the food service side in the US is where most of the shrimp is used.
Anyone who's calling in has a question? Okay, I have a question. John, when you were showing the exports into the certain global markets, China, why was there a spike in 2014, I believe?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. That was a year when there was a lot of shrimp coming onshore. There was very heavy landings, and there was actually a capacity issue where, if I remember right, where some of the plants were worried about their ability to unload and run everything through the cooking and peeling process, and diverting some of that to a whole frozen shrimp head on for sale to China was something that they could do as a capacity management issue. So they would not be they wouldn't turn any vessels away. They would just keep unloading even at a slightly higher rate than they could actually process at a given time. That's my memory of it. Now, other people in the room might want to correct me, but I think there's also a couple of people who wanted to experiment with sales directly to China. And so they were willing to see if that would economically work out. I don't think it was quite necessarily economically that beneficial, and so you saw it kind of fade away again, especially as the volumes dropped down and everybody could handle the rate of landings on the regular cooked and peeled lines.
Else?
I'm
Any other
sorry.
Well, I guess.
All right,
John? Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
John.
John.
Okay, I hope to see some of you guys in Boston. And Elena, everybody, thanks very much. And as always, everybody can email me any questions about the data, or if you have a question about something in there, happy to answer it. I'm sorry I don't have the picture because it feels strange just being a disembodied voice, but that's the way it is.
Well, we will see you in Boston.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Bye, John.
Bye-bye.